Where are you zooming in from?
I'm zooming in from Oxford, actually. Your old clumping ground.
Nice. Is that home?
Yes, that's home for me.
Lovely. It's weird. I'm getting used to the Zoom format. I still haven't quite got. It's a bit weird that you have these meetings where we now get to see. We have morning leader conference with the editors of the paper, and on some days they're usually in the office, but some days they're not, and you get to see, it's weird. You see like my editor's wife walking around the background with his cat jumping over him, and this kind of thing. It's very strange.
It's an odd situation where you start to realise you know more about your boss's background and their work environment, their home environment, than is probably more than correct.
I think think tanks are one of those organisations that just by literally clearing name, it does rely on people rubbing along against each other and coming up with ideas. I just don't. I mean, journalism is hard enough, but I imagine think tanking not in person is just so much worse.
It's a challenge. I don't know. I mean, it must be probably a bit more difficult to get stories for you guys. I'm not sure how it works, but
yeah, I mean, it's not so. But I think there's less happening in general. But there's so much going on with scrutiny of the government, and there's still endless press conferences and briefings and all of that stuff that's being unveiled all at the same time. So I think in that sense, there's a lot to do. I feel like we've never had more work than now because of so much happening in the news. But I guess the difficulty for us is trying to find something, often because I work on the comment desk, so not really like reporting stories. The difficulty is finding a new angle because it just feels like we're in Groundhog Day all the time. So trying to find like a new hook for something about coronavirus, it's like Brexit all over again.
I have a few questions for you, so I'll be throwing a few things. So don't worry, you won't get caught up on the daily grind that you're probably used to. Just with that, I think we've got most of our attendees have sort of signed in.
Welcome to the Roger Scruton Centre's event, A Voice of Meaning in a Rudderless Work with Madeline Grant. I am Lily Naomi Zamplini, a student at UCL. Our host for today is Charlie Woods. He's the program director for the Roger Scruton Centre, and tonight he will be in conversation with Madeline Grant. Madeline is a British journalist and columnist for the Daily Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph. Before we start, I would like to thank our partners for today: Blue Beyond, LSE Conservative Society, Newcastle Conservative Society, Essex University Conservative Society, and Reading University Conservative Association. As you might already know, the legacy of Roger Scruton continues through the work of his family at Scruton, which hosts a summer school at Scruton's beautiful manor farm. We will be sending up to you more information about Scruton after this event. If you have any questions during the event, please enter them in the Q&A box. Add your name and university to your question so we know whose question we are answering to. Thank you so much for your attention, and now back to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Lily, and welcome, Madeline. Welcome to our fantastic audience here tonight. We've got students from across the UK and many people who are involved with both the Roger Scruton Centre and Civitas. I'm going to just go straight into questions tonight. I'm sure you have your own, and I don't want to take up more time than is necessary. Madeline, welcome again. I want to start off with a question in regards to the piece you wrote for the Daily Telegraph, paying tribute to Roger Scruton. You called it Roger Scruton, A Voice of Meaning in a Rudderless World. What influence did Roger Scruton have on your own views about politics and the way that people can flourish in their everyday life?
Well, for me, what I love about Roger Scruton and why I think he's so rare and so special is that he is a conservative philosopher, and by definition there aren't so many of those, because conservatives are really, they're not like the left. The left are quite given to having long meetings where you talk about ideology. They're into sort of often being quite heavy-handed with their dogmas, and the resonance of Scruton for me is the fact that as a conservative, we're often not very good at articulating why we think things. We kind of instinctively know them to be true, but we don't really go into great detail about why we think things a certain way. And often I think the conservative instinct, if you ask a conservative to explain why they are a conservative, they won't necessarily do a good job of it, but they know what it is they value and they want to protect. And for me, there was no one who better than Roger Scruton at putting all of that into language. And therefore, I think for many conservatives, you read Roger Scruton and you feel like it's sort of like the voice in your head, but so much more eloquent than the voice in your head. But it's explaining what you believe, but you can never put it into such, what often was thought, but never so well expressed. And so for me, that's kind of the resonance. I've been interested in, I think I first got into Scruton when I was a student. I went to see him speak. I never actually met him properly, but I did see him speak on a number of occasions. And the first time was when I was at university. I just remember him being very, very generous in a way, kind of academically generous. We asked some pretty bloody stupid questions, and he was very kind and sort of genuinely seemed very interested in what we had to say, which I think is a very rare, good quality, welcoming, proper, open debate. And that sense of, as people used to say at school, you know, there are no wrong answers. But of course, in a world of cancel culture, we know that that's not true. The wrong answer can get you into a lot of trouble. And I really admired the way that Roger Scruton sort of welcomed that kind of very collegiate, very good-natured style of debate. And I think it's very much lacking at the moment.
How do you assess his work as a former English student and his writing?
Well, that's another great thing about Roger Scruton, that he writes so beautifully. Another thing that made me love Scruton was that at the time I started taking interest in him, I was having to study, I did English, and you at the same time that you're learning about Shakespeare and Milton, Jane Austen and George Eliot, you also have to do literary theory. So it means that one week you'll be doing George Eliot, but then I would have to write an essay on George Eliot, and then the same week I'd also have to write one on Foucault or Derrida. And you very quickly get a sense of who's a good communicator and who's not. And the Foucauldian school, I think, is often that they use incredibly complicated language that almost seems designed to alienate people. And I think that is partly a deliberate strategy, because it's a way of disguising the fundamental vapidness of their ideas. Whereas I think Roger Scruton is the opposite. He's in the school of writing. I'd say it's similar to George Orwell, where it's all about using language, often simply not making it overly elaborate, trying to make it explicable to anyone, because you want your ideas to reach the widest possible audience. Whereas I think that some of the academics that he criticised, and the ones that I had to study at university, and I was really bad at and got 2 2s in all my essays on, were the ones who sort of deliberately wrap up their language in as complex a way as possible. It almost seems designed to alienate rather than to bring other people with you, which is, in a way, the way he wrote is kind of similar to the collegiate way that he engaged with the world, if that makes sense.
No, certainly. And that's a really nice way of putting it. An area where Scrutonian philosophy seems to be having a very tangible impact on public policy is architecture and restoring beauty to public buildings. Why do you think building beautifully is important? And are there examples of initiatives which you think are helping to move society towards creating more beautiful buildings and public spaces?
Well, why is it important? Well, it's incredibly high stakes in Britain right now, because we've got a massive housing crisis on our hands. There's a culture of the way our planning system is set up. It's very easy for neighbourhoods to reject new developments. And there's a kind of NIMBYist culture as well, where people are often inclined to say no rather than yes. And then you look at some of the things that have been agreed in recent years and you think, well, I can't really blame you for being a NIMBY, because that is absolutely disgusting. So building beautifully isn't just a kind of aesthetic preference. It's something that has a real public policy, the ability to do good. And for me, it's very important, because it's killing multiple birds with one stone. You create a more beautiful world, so you have beauty in and of itself, which is an important thing. And it's, as Roger Scruton always said, it's not a kind of, beauty as a form of rationality. You can't really engage with the world until you've engaged with what's beautiful and transcendent. So there's that lofty bit. But then there's also the other aspects of it, which are creating the next generation of conservatives by, if you build beautifully, you build more, you solve the housing crisis. And it's one of those actually rare ideas where all the different strands of conservatives can agree on it. You know, the free marketeers can agree with the post-liberals and the Scrutonian Oakeshottian small C conservatives. We can all agree that we need more homes and that they should be beautiful. And it's a solution to, I think, what is the biggest public policy crisis of our time.
So when you look across the United Kingdom today, is there anywhere that comes to mind for you where you think this is the kind of thing where we should be looking and learning and taking inspiration from?
Well, I think you should look at what you don't do. So go to Coventry. Coventry I mentioned because I grew up in Warwickshire, And my grandma grew up in Coventry during the Second World War. So she lived with the much nicer city I can't, is it a city? No, it's a town. I can't, who knows? But it's a city. What am I talking about? But she grew up with Coventry as was, when it was still very beautiful. And then obviously the Blitz, it was heavily affected by the Blitz. And then after that, it was rebuilt by very ideologically driven planners in the 50s and 60s. And they imported a lot of the kind of the sort of the Le Corbusier attitude towards building, where it's a kind of machine for living. Concerns like beauty, privacy, the individual, these things get relegated to the ideological goal you have in mind. And it was just watching a place, a much loved place, sort of deteriorate into this unrecognisable cityscape where, for example, they had things like massive big motorways, giant ring road, tall blocks of flats, and things that take away from that sense of human scale that's so important to beauty. So look at Coventry for what not to do, and then I think look at what has there are certain types of housing across the country that we know that people love because it's reflected in the high value of those houses. You know, Georgian terraces. It's things like, you know, a nice cottage. They exist all up and down the country, and often they've survived because people wanted them and they've stuck. And also buildings that can be used for different things. So you have a beautiful shop. The shop may go under, but that beautiful shop can still be converted into a beautiful home. And that buildings that have a kind of multiple utility to them, that is a sure thing to look for. I think many of the buildings that were built in haste after the Second World War, they were thinking in terms of, well, economy, hence the use of the concrete and everything. But they didn't think ahead that actually concrete buildings are terrible because they require so much maintenance and they don't have a long shelf life. So it's actually better to spend more and get a better product that will last and that future generations will treasure and want to keep because they can see the beauty and the value of them.
The next question I have for you, Madeline, is around the government's free speech champion. I know education is something that you care deeply about and have written on. So the government will be appointing a free speech champion to look at free speech across university campuses. Will this figure be enough to restore freedom of speech at universities, in your opinion? And is this actually just a symptom of a wider problem of the state of British education at universities?
I don't think it will be enough to have a single free speech champion, not least because these things, I'm not sure even how I feel about the government deciding these things from the top down. I think that the problem we have is cultural, and it goes way back. It goes back to those academics that we were just talking about. It goes back decades, and often the attitude begins at school. You know, so it's not, university is often a symptom of the values that people have been told to have been force fed at school. So I don't think it's that simple. It's a society-wide issue. I'm glad that the government is taking this problem really seriously, because it is a real problem. I get very, very, very annoyed about hearing left wingers will often say things like, well, cancel culture isn't real. It's just flat out, fundamentally is, and it's my old college at Oxford, St Hilda's, one of the academics there, Selina Todd, for believing traditional things about traditional. She believes in the concept of biological sex. I don't know if that's traditional. I suppose that probably is traditional nowadays. But just for believing that, she is hounded wherever she goes, and she has to have bodyguards. Tell her that cancel culture isn't real. I think I'm glad that the government is taking a stand, but I think the problem really it's the academy itself. There are so few academics who seem to share these values. It's been a big cultural shift, I think, ever since the generation that came of age in the 1960s, the generation of the sort of 67 spirit and the Paris riots, and which was actually what first inspired Roger Scruton into becoming a conservative, I think. It's that generation came of age, and it did mark a profound cultural shift from the previous generation of academics, who many of whom had, for example, left or right, that had fought in the Second World War. So there was a kind of shared hatred of a shared culture and shared values. Whereas I think there was a kind of intellectual nihilism from the 60s onwards, which has seeped its way into academia, and it's very pervasive. I mean, I think the best way to start is to, well, it's useful to gather together like-minded people. It's important. I think things like the Free Speech Union that Toby Young set up, that kind of thing is very important, so that people feel that they are not alone. Because I think in academia, I've lost count of the number of times, you know, we will often try to commission, for example, a piece about, say, Brexit, and there are academics who we know privately to be in favour of Brexit, and we ask them to write for us, and they just will not come on the record to talk about it. But I think when people feel that they have there is safety in numbers, that, you know, they can express their view and other people will back them up, that's very important, because that in turn it sort of empowers people. But the culture of conformity in academia was bad for academia. It's bad for the students who have to go through it. It's bad for all of us, really.
Are there key cultural issues or topics that you think we can use or rally around? I'm thinking particularly around Winston Churchill, for example. If we think about the situation that happened where statues were suddenly being toppled, and there was this sense across the UK of, I wouldn't say lawlessness, but just a sense of what's going on here. There doesn't appear to be a set law, a set order. Things feel very much in flux, and it generated a lot of uncertainty until the Churchill statue became threatened, and people seemed to rally together for the first time. Sadly, perhaps not the Prime Minister straight away, but he did get there eventually. So other than Winston Churchill, perhaps, and including Winston Churchill, are there points where you think, actually, this is the Conservative moment, the point to say no, or say, actually, hesitate, as Roger Scruton would say?
That's a really good question. I think Winston Churchill is a good one, because I don't like statue toppling at the best of times. It's not. I don't think it's a good way to go about deciding public memorials through vandalism. Whoever is involved. But luckily, when they go for someone as transparently difficult to cancel as Winston Churchill, it does become easier for people to cluster around that. I mean, I think the issue is still that the vast majority of rank and file members of the public would agree with that, but within the academy, the thought might be different. I was just amazed by I continue to be amazed by how many academics who supposedly uphold academic freedom were busy justifying this sort of thing, apologising for it. I saw historians who, they of all people know what happens when you empower the angry mob, were basically saying, well, this is history in the making if statues are being pulled down. And I just thought that was very narrow-minded. But I think the difference is that the vast majority of the general public thinks one thing, the vast majority of the academy thinks something else.
I wanted to ask you a question about current Conservative Party. How do you assess them as Conservatives as such, with a small c? Because they seem to have done quite a decent job in certain areas. They seem to have championed quite effectively the idea of Britain as an independent nation state. They got Brexit done, which is what they campaigned on. But going forward, they have this very large majority, and all their time seems to be spent on solving coronavirus. Do you think that this government has an opportunity or could take steps whereby it adds something to the history, the continuity of the Conservative movement?
Yeah, I think they have a huge opportunity. They've got an incredibly weakened Labour Party. I mean, even with Keir Starmer in charge, they still don't, even though he's made big progress from turning them into a credible party from the days of Jeremy Corbyn, I still think that their big problem is that none of their messages seem to really seep through. People just kind of washes over people. They don't really know what the Labour Party stands for right now. They've got an 80-seat majority, but you wouldn't know it from the way that they go about things. I mean, the statues was a good example, but there are tons of other ones. I mean, it's sort of hard to think beyond coronavirus sometimes, because, you know, that nevertheless, these issues really do matter to people. It really did matter to people, for example, that Jeremy Corbyn didn't feel like a patriot. That was important. And I think that they do get that, to be fair. They've got various people in cabinet who are taking the culture war very seriously. So I mean, I don't know what they're going to do with it, because it's just, I suppose it's just hard to think outside of the coronavirus bubble right now. I also think actually that Brexit, the decision to vote leave has been very much, many of the things that Brexiteers said about the European Union have kind of been proven to be true in the way that they've handled the vaccination rollout. And I think this goes back to what Roger Scruton, his view of Brexit was that this was something that wasn't a big, actually, Conservatives are not revolutionaries, they don't like big change. And one of the accusations that was levied at Brexiteers was that you're Conservatives, why do you want to shake everything up and tear everything down? But actually, he would view Brexit as something that was actually returning to a previous way that was the right way all along, so to speak. That's a bit different to just mindless iconoclasm. That has been vindicated as well, because things have been managed pretty well at the nation state level during the pandemic, and the European Union hasn't managed the kind of multilateral, plurilateral things very well at all. Even in the way, for example, Germany, the way that they sought to take control of things, the way that they tried to divert supplies towards their own citizens, it shows that even the real power brokers in the European Union, they know, as Scruton knew, fundamentally that the nation state kind of is more important than the multilateral one. And perhaps had the European Union stuck to areas of cooperation and areas that you can cluster around like free trade without having to actually pool sovereignty, then I probably wouldn't be, there probably would have been no need for Brexit at all.
I'm going to take our first question, and this is from an anonymous attendee. Do you know any current Conservative politicians who actually share the same kind of Conservative values and ideas espoused by Roger Scruton?
Well, that's a good, I mean, I wouldn't claim to be the kind of the Conservative par excellence myself, and I don't claim to know too many MPs that closely. I would say that Michael Gove is a good example of someone who was clearly very influenced by Scrutonian ideas about the Western canon and about Western civilization being something that's, well, worth defending, but also something that's for everyone. It's not some kind of elite inheritance. It's something that we should all appreciate, and it's also something that binds people together, a kind of common culture that we can all speak. So I think you see that in the educational reforms of someone like Michael Gove and free schools and things like that. So that's one example. Of course, Create Streets, which is the initiative that's been taken up by the government in a big way, was partly Roger Scruton's venture, which he was working on right until the end of his life. And that's become highly influential. I do think that is something that the DCLG really does take seriously. They've given a lot of time to it. I mean, of course, there was the appalling treatment of Roger Scruton himself, the cowardly decision to sack him after the disgraceful hit job interview with the New Statesman. So that was cowardly. But I think since then they've reevaluated things, and they do seem to be taking those ideas forward very seriously. So in that respect, there's certainly aspects of sort of Scrutonian philosophy that are coming through in a quite a tangible way in terms of public policy. But the big issue, I think, with current politics is that it's just quite conformist. It's partly because of Twitter and cancel culture. People are quite scared of saying the wrong thing and being sort of censured by the left. And so in that sense, I think there's a bit of the tyranny of the majority winning out, which is something that Roger Scruton was very good at warning against. But I wouldn't blame that entirely on the MPs. It's partly the culture of intellectual exchange that we're in at the moment.
You're a major influencer and you have a huge number of followers, and a lot of MPs follow you and other thinkers. Is there perhaps a way that you think you could, any way you can see bringing more ideas from people like Roger, people like Michael Oakeshott and others, and sort of getting that thought, that kind of questioning into their minds? I know that's easier said than done, certainly, because MPs are constantly, working on their constituency work. They've got to worry about, bills and so forth coming up. They also, a lot of them will want to get promoted. So actual time for thinking is not the easiest thing to actually get. But is there a way that you think people such as yourself and others who are very, very big on taking ideas and those interesting conversations and thoughts forward, as it were?
Well, I mean, before I worked at the Telegraph, I worked at a think tank. And I actually think that the best way to influence public policy isn't to go directly via the politicians. You win round the public. You bring people with you. You explain your ideas as well as you can, and you try to win arguments in a decent way. And then once you have public opinion on your side, then the politicians have to take notice. It's the kind of the tail has to wag the dog, I suppose, in that respect. So I mean, obviously there's some good initiatives, and it's great to get MPs, you know, on panels and to talk about these ideas. And it does seem like there are more MPs than ever that are genuinely interested in the culture war and feel it's important, which is, I think, also a sign of the fact that the public feels very strongly about this sort of thing. I mean, in terms of like my role now, I suppose you might say I'm not sure if I'm an influencer. I mean, my job most of the time is doing the parliamentary sketching, so it's basically taking the piss out of MPs. So I'm not sure if that's a good format to like bring them to my way of thinking, but you know, I just think sometimes trying to be funny is a good way of doing it, because I find it's harder to get cancelled for ideas if you've made a joke, because if they start to piece apart the point you've made and you've done it in a jokey way, then if they go too serious and start trying to debunk you in that way, then they just look a bit humourless. So you kind of already won the argument.
When you write your articles, it's interesting, you talk about humour and you talk about winning people over in this way. The issue around cancellation, is there a way that you have to censor yourself in some scenarios because you are worried that actually your articles may have a long-term ramification? And is this a problem in journalism today, particularly at papers such as the Daily Telegraph and the Times and those that are right-leaning?
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, I think to go back to what I was saying at the very beginning about when I first met Roger Scruton and watched him interact with people, what I really liked about him was the way that I felt that he didn't approach arguments in a bad faith way. So, you know, that you could say something, you could garble your words and say something in a bad, you know, come out completely not the way that you intended to say it, and that it's the kind of the attitude where you would approach intellectual engagement in good faith. And there's a real absence of that, and I think particularly on the left, but it's sort of on both sides it's growing, partly because of social media. It just encourages hostility. I've given up Twitter for Lent, and it's done no end of good, because I've stopped caring what the reaction is to the articles, because, you know, ultimately, obviously I want people to enjoy what I write, but a lot of the people on Twitter are disproportionately going to dislike what I say because it's more of a left-wing platform. So giving too much credence to social media is kind of not a good idea for a conservative journalist in the first place. So yeah, I try not to let it, but of course it does. You know, you only have to, we live in a world, as we know from what happened to Roger Scruton, the idea that someone who's created that output, that body of work over decades, has only ever approached debate, has been a hero, has gone behind the Iron Curtain to help people and to bring new intellectual arguments to parts of the world where proper intellectual debate has been completely clamped down on by the state. The idea that you can do all that, and then one interview where some little scoundrel can take your words and garble them and misrepresent them, and then within weeks you can be sacked from your job on the government commission, hounded by like large swathes of kind of right-thinking society. The fact that that can happen so quickly because of one dishonest interview is kind of terrifying. So obviously that's always at the back of your mind, that, you know, you're only ever one stupid tweet away from being cancelled. It's something we all have to live with, I suppose. But I guess, and the other thing that's scary about what happened with Roger Scruton was the fact that he only seems to have had his rehabilitation because people like Douglas Murray worked hard to sort of exonerate him. He had people who were able to help him, and there were so many supporters who rallied around him. But there's lots of people who don't have that recourse, who get completely screwed over by it.
You've appeared multiple times, particularly on the BBC's Politics Live. Do you find that there is always a sort of danger, or there's always a sort of instinct on the part of producers to push the presenter towards getting a sort of gotcha question for someone like you who's very outspoken in your beliefs?
I don't find that with Politics Live. I think Joe Coburn's a brilliant host, and I don't feel that the setup is there to make you look stupid. I more often find that sometimes I've done things where I'm on with a left wing, particularly during Brexit. Actually, I think during that Brexit period, it was really angry on both sides, and you'd be up against. I did one with Femi, and he was. I don't know if you've come across Femi, but he was on the rampage, and I said something, and then he just clipped. He took a small clip of what I'd said, and then put it on Twitter, but it was completely divorced from all context. And I remember feeling a bit like, well, that was a bit weird. We had a 10-minute conversation, and now this weird little snippet has been kind of shared multiple times, and lots of people were saying, oh God, you're such an idiot. I guess the trick is not to give too much of a damn about it if you can avoid it. But of course it's difficult because it feels very all encompassing.
The good news is that I think this is the first time that most of our viewers will have ever heard of Femi, and we don't recommend you Google him.
I'm glad to have burst that bubble.
We take a question now from Hilary. Roger Scruton was a champion of the aesthetic sense. With the arts and humanities becoming increasingly political, is there any hope that his vision of architecture and the importance of environmental beauty can be revived? We did talk about this a bit before, but perhaps we could expand on this to think about the world of art and other public spaces such as museums. Museums are also currently under a huge amount of pressure to introduce labels, to take things off. I currently live in Oxford, and Pitt Rivers Museum has very sadly taken away its famous
heads.
Yes, the shrunken heads, which are such an important part of Oxford's culture. And anybody who saw the recent Northern Lights TV series, which comes from Philip Pullman's very famous series of children's books, there's a really iconic scene with the shrunken heads, and the fact that one of the most one of the best children's books on anti-authoritarianism, and its author doesn't speak out when there's effectively this kind of imposed kind of cultural censorship. Seems crazy.
Well, one thing that does give me hope actually is that if you look at surveys of attitude amongst the generations, people often assume that each generation gets kind of more and more progressive as time goes by, but actually in all sorts of measures. I think I'm a millennial. I was born in 1992. I think the sound generation that follows on from the millennials, I think beginning in 1996, I think is where the Zoomer generation begins. Lots of areas in which the Zoomers seem to take a much less authoritarian attitude towards things like free speech. So that in a way gives me hope. I mean, when it comes to things like museums, I mean, I think actually this is where the government could do some good, really, because for a long time, under Tony Blair especially, they tended to kind of pack out the big cultural advisory type jobs with their own. So there was a kind of expansion both of the quangos and the kind of the people who worked for them, who often all subscribed to that viewpoint. So if the Conservatives really went for it, I think they could get a lot of people who would share their view into these kinds of positions. I guess the issue is that right now they've got a lot of other stuff on their plate, but this is a really important opportunity, and they should be going for it. There are some signs that they are, with they've picked a Conservative to be the chairman of the BBC, and this sort of thing. But they should go further in the cultural arena too, because I think the public is very much on side with all this. People don't like to see their culture continually trashed. And I think there's a very rather patronising view amongst some on the left that people are incapable of adding context to. So if you go to a house where the homeowner profited from slavery, it doesn't mean that you endorse slavery or something. And you can put that up with some context rather than saying that we mustn't show this thing at all. But there are so many on the left who seem to sort of patronise people and think that they can't actually be trusted to examine these things without some kind of rather prescriptive. Well, actually, it's more that they shouldn't be able to look at them at all, which is what many people want to do when they say take away things like the shrunken heads.
To a question from Mark. So Roger was a church organist for many years. How important do you think the Christian faith is in the wider defence of Judeo-Christian civilization against the left?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's one of those things where you can... Roger Scruton's attitude towards religion was, I think, if I've got this right, I don't want to misrepresent the great man, but it was that religion is a bit, in a way, he thought it was a bit like art to him, which is something that it can give you some transcendence. It can lift you out of your surroundings and kind of ennoble the human spirit. And so religion has an importance that goes beyond, obviously the belief is so important if you happen to be a believer, but I very much agree with Sir Roger that whether or not you believe yourself, it's got this extreme cultural importance that is worth defending in and of itself. You know, it's impossible, for example, to study any great literature before about 1900 without some knowledge of the Bible. So in that respect, you have to defend it in order for us all to have before we even get on to dealing with left-wing dogmas, that just to have a kind of common cause with each other that previous generations had. People have references that everyone gets, the values that are shared by everyone. This is actually integral to keeping a country together, keeping a coherent nation. Without these things, the unity just kind of crumbles. As for dealing with the left, I mean, I suppose that there is a lot of anger on the left about things like there being bishops in the House of Lords and this sort of thing. I think that the battle for these sorts of things can be fought both on the basis of, you know, religious freedom but also just, you know, in terms of culture, what matters to us. I just think, you know, if you have a traditionalist view that the Western canon is important, then it means that, of course, you value the religion, which is so fundamental to the cultural inheritance.
I think that this is a very interesting area that Conservatives should definitely look at. If we look at the works of Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, as well as Moses Maimonides and Guide to the Perplexed, these are all foundations of our heritage, and you can take these forward to the very modern thinkers such as Roger, who takes a more romanticist view of Christianity, and then the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who wrote some absolutely terrific books on the importance of religion in public life, and with his particular focus on Judaism. So these are all areas that I think we should read more about and incorporate more, actually, and it's a good source of inspiration. One of Roger's great strengths was romanticism, and I think that touch of British romanticism is something that we should definitely capture. Keith Miles. So Keith was a student of Sir Roger's. He says, Roger told me that taking facts or comments out of context is a great modern danger in society. Do you agree?
Yeah. Oh, I could not agree more. When you add that to the twin demon of social media and the kind of instant audience that you can get, I mean, we've kind of talked about this already, but those two things in tandem are a recipe for disaster. And then when you add to that also increasingly confrontational gotcha style of interviewing, style of politics, it's of course, it's there. I suppose that the way to counteract it, and it's so awful that this had to happen, that Sir Roger had to get first-hand experience of this exact thing in such a horrific way, because he had so often warned against it. He talked about people we don't fight with weapons anymore, we kind of bludgeon to death via their reputations, or something along those lines. I probably misquoted that horribly, but it was kind of dreadful that he had to experience that firsthand. But I suppose that the best defense is to go through life, and I hate the fact that we have to live like this, but perhaps to go through life keeping a record of exactly what you did say, so that if it comes to it, you can sort of exonerate yourself. It's a rather similar thing happened with Jordan Peterson recently. He was interviewed by The Guardian, and they attempted a very one-sided hatchet job type interview, but he had been very careful to make sure that he had tapes of the entire interview. So on that basis, he was able to put his own side of the story across and defend his own reputation. That's probably the way to go about it, but I just wish we didn't have to live like that.
I believe it's Alderic asks, to my mind, part of Roger Scruton's thought concerns the environment. Are there any signs that his work on environmental matters are being picked up on in the UK? And this refers to Roger's green philosophy, which was much more of a focus, was a sort of refocus from big government solutions to more local solutions. Do you think that conservationist approach is something that Conservatives and the government could be encouraging more?
I do. I think that they're obviously very concerned about the environment, but it is a bit of a mixed bag. And I think that a lot of what they're doing at the moment is quite top-down, centralised approach to tackling these environmental concerns that I'm not sure Roger Scruton would have quite agreed with. I mean, I don't want to be a Scruton whisperer, but I think that the ones that actually they have recently started, which I'm very much support, is looking more at how you tax energy consumption. So people doing a kind of Pigovian style tax offsetting of the carbon emissions that you created in generating a certain product, let's say. And that's something that looks likely to be brought in under the Johnson administration. I think actually carbon taxes, I think he articulated in Green Philosophy, or definitely something I've read of his, he was in favour of the idea. I mean, one of his great strengths to me was the fact that, you know, he made it very clear that the environment is a shared concern, and it's also an area in which you can't cede it to the left, not just because there's a political opportunity by taking ownership of the environment, which is what the current government is trying to do, but also because it is our shared inheritance. And there's absolutely no reason why Conservatives, I mean, clear in name, conserving, why we should be less animated to these principles. And I guess the other danger is that if Conservatives are not concerned about this, then you do completely vacate that space to either people who, either the top-down approach, or worse, the kind of millenarian Greta Thunberg Extinction Rebellion approach, which wants to dismantle capitalism and, you know, revert to kind of pre-industrial revolution style of living. So you've got, we're going to have to deal with this issue one way or the other, and there are lots of conservative solutions, and many of which Roger Scruton articulated in books like Green Philosophy.
Diego asks, a common criticism is that Roger Scruton's conservatism was no longer a disposition, as pointed out by Michael Oakeshott, but had become an agenda. What do you guys think of that? Ooh. Have we become an agenda? Madeline.
That's a good question. I mean, I said at the beginning that people often struggle to articulate their conservatism, but they feel it when what they value most is under threat. And I think it was Roger Scruton who said that everyone is a conservative about what they know best or what they love best. And I think it just so happened that in recent years particularly, lots of things that Roger Scruton very much did value were under threat. So then you go from your natural, you know, conservatism is, you might call it reactionary or just reactive. It's defending something. You go into defending mode a lot because what you value is constantly being attacked. I still think that is a disposition, but it's I suppose it's like an animal that's been sort of poked with a stick, as opposed to one that's kind of constantly marauding, trying to hunt everything in sight, which is what the left does.
Jennifer Haydari, is the government's agenda towards reducing the number of students going to university going to be is it going to undermine the value of the arts and humanities in society?
It's a good question. I must admit, I don't feel I know enough about that to say, but I haven't enjoyed some of the noises that I've been hearing from Conservatives about this. You know, there does seem to be a very dismissive attitude towards the humanities for sure. And I think part of it actually, weirdly, is they think they're doing what Roger Scruton might have, because part of the reason I think they feel that, you know, you often hear just kind of politicians speaking in less than warm terms about these disciplines. I think it's because they see it as a kind of hotbed of left-wing radicalism. But the solution to that isn't to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, after all, how on earth do the Conservatives intend to win the culture war if they don't actually have any Conservatives who are kind of in culture, who are engaged, who are authors and writing books and all the rest of it? You know, it's one of the issues they have with trying to reclaim some of the kind of the Tony Blair march through the institutions and the Quango stuff, is that there simply aren't enough eligible, there may not be enough eligible right-wing people to actually do those jobs. So I'm a bit concerned. I mean, I think that the whole question of the way that universities are structured and modelled is kind of fundamentally unsustainable as things currently stand, and there needs to be a big shake-up. But as ever with so much in government, there's just this, it's easier to just kick the can down the road and leave that to a future administration to sort out.
Say you were Professor Madeline Grant, and you are back at St Hilda's. Maybe not St Hilda's. I'll give you the college of your choice, or I'll even give you Cambridge. God forbid. But you set your reading list for your new students. I'm assuming you're doing English. You may wish to choose another.
Well, I was such a mediocre student that I feel bad for anyone who's having to be on my reading list or whatever, or take my classes. But yeah, I think it would probably be English. What would be on the reading list?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think it would be, if it was literature, I think I would probably can Foucault and quite a lot of the postmodernists and the existentialists, because most of them can't write worth a damn, and it's the fact that they can't write is not pure coincidence. It's to disguise the fact that what they're saying is often quite not particularly sophisticated, but it's a bit of it reminds me slightly of The Emperor's New Clothes. It's naked, there's nudity of ideas, but no one is brave enough to say that this doesn't actually mean anything, or this is nonsense. There's these famous lines from, I think it's Judith Butler is the one who writes famously badly. I mean, they all do, but she has this one, there's a few extracts of Judith Butler that you just cannot believe that somebody actually wrote this. It's sort of eight line sentences of pure drivel. So I would probably get rid of quite a few of these, or at least cut down their influence. When I was studying, it was quite unfashionable to do historicist readings of texts where you take into account the cultural context and the historical context. I just think it seems so transparently obvious that the historical context of a work of literature would have had some big impact on it. So the idea that you would just only look at the text, as Derrida said, that strikes me as, I certainly wouldn't want to create an environment in which you were being told that historicism was a bad way of approaching literature.
I mean, it would mean that if you took Edward Gibbon's The Fall of Rome, you just wouldn't understand it. It would be a completely superfluous text, even though it's not literature, it's history, but which is my BA. So no, I get what you mean. In regards to this particular situation that we find ourselves in with Scotland, at the moment, it seems that we've taken for granted that the union has remained intact. We Better Together campaign won, but there has been, in the last several years now, a big shift in attitudes in Scotland. And one of the key political battles that Britain's politicians may have to face again is this risk of a second referendum. How can the case for the union be carried forward? What can be sort of done, probably including actually taking on the SNP?
Yeah, and the SNP are doing a great job of taking on themselves.
Yes.
I think history is a full and fair account of history. One, I think, will show the benefits of the union, the shared successes that Great Britain had, and the achievements. I think that's a good start, rather than allowing this very one-sided tale of subjugation of Scotland by England to be told. I think it's important to revert to, well, not just to do it in a kind of, I think there's a danger with the current approach to unionism where it sort of repeats some of the mistakes of the Remain campaign during the Brexit referendum, where it only talks about kind of money, and it's quite cold economic calculus of kind of trying to scare the Scots into staying in because the alternative of separatism is just too economically damaging. And I think that's you need to make the emotional case for the union as well. You need to, I guess, I mean, I have some Scottish ancestry and family in Scotland. You know, you need to talk about the reality of what that means, the fact that there are Scottish people living all over the UK and there are English people living in Scotland and loving it, and that these bonds, they are meaningful and they are not to be discarded lightly.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. Very Scrutonian again. This is the final question from Mark. How do you reconcile the ideas of the current Conservative Party and their idea of a global Britain?
Well, I think actually, to me, global Britain is, the ideas of it, I thought it was just a bit of a corporate slogan when I first heard it, but actually look at what's happening with striking trade deals and with the way that Britain has reacted. So, for example, with the vaccines, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, so it's an incredible innovation, but most of all because, unlike the other available vaccines, it can be transported at it doesn't need to be at a particularly low temperature. it's cheap to export, it's likely that that's going to be the one that vaccinates the world. And they also arranged the contract for that in such a way that they were not doing it to make profit and it would be readily exportable around the world. That to me is a really good example of global Britain, values driven, you know, wanting to thinking in terms of the whole world. And then you can contrast that with how the European Union has dealt with it. And I think that's a ringing endorsement of global Britain. And then also things like very exciting thing of welcoming hundreds of thousands potentially or more Hong Kong citizens to Britain right after they've been cast out by authoritarian China. I mean, to me that is, or rather, well, not cast out, but sort of they've had their democratic norms completely violated, offering citizenship. You know, it's not empty platitudes and gestures, basically. So I think actually global Britain is already looking quite good.
Fantastic. And with that, Madeline, thank you so much for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the wonderful writing that you give us through the Daily Telegraph and your championing of conservative ideas and continuing Roger Scruton's legacy. From all of us here at the Roger Scruton Centre, thank you so much. And to our audience, I'd like to say good night.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.